Hello, my name is John Champion. I'm with Sisu Archery, and I'm responding to a request from the Atlatl in Arrow Facebook site. And they had a question about what the wild rosin looks like and how to identify it and where it's located. Right now, I'm in northern Indiana, about a mile short of the Michigan border. That's where I live, and there are county parks and there are state parks that are just filled with this invasive plant that I will harvest and make my arrows from. Now, the plant used to be used for like natural fences and stuff like that, but it's gotten out of hand and it's basically found out in the wild now. This is the plant itself. This is an example of a very long stem, but these things grow in bushes. This is one bush here. There are several bushes as I go to back behind me that just fill this whole area, and they basically engulf the birch trees, the river birch trees. This is probably about the best time of year I use to harvest these. Late fall. You can find shafts throughout the year though. Um, the Again, the leaf pattern looks like this. It is, I believe, what we call a multiflora in this area. In the summer, around June timeframe, it will produce a small, pretty little flower. What I'm looking for when I look for a stem is something on the order of, well, the size of my pinky, at least at the base of the stem, about the size of the diameter of my pinky when I pick out one of these. I'm going to see if I can actually pull one out down here. These things are very vicious. They've got these thorns. That's why I wear gloves and long sleeve shirt and pants, and they still can get me though. I'm going to try to take one here. I'm thinking it's probably a little bit on the narrow side. I'll clip it off there. I typically am looking for something that's at least a 30 inch, closer, hopefully 36 inches or so, because that gives me some room for some waste. So this is not too bad. This might give me a shaft of a lower spine weight, because what happens is as these things dry out, the shaft itself actually narrows down, and this one might give me something for maybe a draw weight of maybe 30 to 40 pounds, but we'll see. Sometimes you just don't see them right off. Sometimes they see you and they grab you, which is actually pretty thick down at the bottom. And but it thins out quite a bit, quite quickly though, which is a concern. But yeah, so that's definitely long enough to work with. So again, thorns, they don't like to be picked. Here's another bush, some young shoots. Usually about the second year, these shoots will be large enough to harvest some shafts. My wife and I were out hiking around and we harvested some wild rose from the area parks. We have county parks and state parks where I harvest the wild rose, which is an invasive plant. The rangers in this particular area are welcome. The idea of me coming out there and removing some of the wild rose that gets into the trail heads and stuff like that. So anyway, wild rose and red osier, pretty much what I use for making my primitive arrows, and particularly the wild rose because it tends to stay straight when you straighten it out. And so I've built many arrows out of this stuff, and I just want to go through the process after I've harvested the shafts. And I've got laid out on the table here the different steps, or I'll try to talk to the different steps anyway. It's actually a time-consuming process. I bring back the wild rose, and in this first pile, I think there's about 21 different shafts that I brought back. They have had their stickers or their thorns removed, and which is the process I hate the most about this, because your hands get all beat up. You need to wear a glove to make sure you don't get a lot of pokes on your hand. What I did with this pile here is, as soon as I brought them back, I removed the thorns, and then I spent my first night just hand straightening the shafts, just to get them started. And the process I do, which is just something I've kind of invented along the way, and I don't know if others do it as well, but I'll spend a good week with the shafts as harvested. They need to be at least, I'd say at least 36 inches in length, because what will happen over time is when the shafts start to dry out, they will check at the ends. And so basically what you're going to end up doing is chopping them off at the ends here. Over the course of a week, I will keep the bark on, and then I will continue just to hand straighten these things. I'll sit around the TV at night, or listen to music or whatever, and just spend a couple hours just going through and just hand straightening them. And it will take about a week's worth of straightening every night. Just spend a little time on each one of them, and you'll get to a point where they won't straighten any further that way. The second pile here, I've gotten about a week's worth of straightening completed on some of these shafts. What I'll do is I'll actually strip the bark, strip it off, and then things start to happen rather quickly. Because the bark is off, the shaft starts to dry out rather quickly, and that's when you start to getting your checking at the end of each, and you'll see that occur. You leave it. I'll spend another week doing exactly the same thing, just hand straightening them. This is an example of a series of shafts that I started about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And what I will do then is, once they've gotten about as straight as possible, I will actually sand them down a little bit, get them into a bit of a dowel shape. And what's very nice about the wild roses is they do tend to have a slight taper from what I would use as the knock end. Here's a good example where the knock end is a little bit thinner, and then you get to the other end, you got a little bit thicker dowel, and that produces a nice flying arrow, or the center of gravity of the shaft ahead of the center, or the center of pressure of the shaft, which helps with flight. It makes a stable flight, which is very similar to what they do when they design javelins. I get to about this stage here, and it's been sanded down. Any of the knots or any of the high points get sanded down as much as possible. Of course, being a natural shaft, you don't get it all completely sanded to a point like you have a perfect dowel, but it's a primitive arrow. So then I'll let these things sit for another couple of weeks. Actually, probably up to about 4 weeks to still dry out. And then the last step before starting to make the arrows is I will heat treat it. Obviously, primitive or indigenous people didn't have heat guns, and I used to just do it over an open flame or open fire as well as what the primitive man or the indigenous people did. And of course, I produced too many shafts these days to make that worth the time. So what I will do is use a heat gun and speed up the process. But I will heat treat the shafts, and do at least um, one more straightening process. And by the way, I forgot to mention, when I do reduce the shaft diameters, I'll just use a piece of sandpaper like this, and then do the majority of the reduction using a coarse sandpaper. Get the diameter down to what I need it to be, or I believe it needs to be. And I'll also use, basically what I do is I cut a groove. Basically, I'll take a piece of wood or 2x4 and drill a hole. This is 11/32 diameter hole. I'll drill it through and I'll cut it in half. And then I'll put sandpaper in there and glue it in. And then I'll use this as a means of just running the shaft back and forth and twisting it and getting it down to help me reduce the shaft diameter and get a nice smooth shaft. So, like I said, you get to a point where it sits there for about 4 weeks and dries out again. I do the heat treat on it, straighten it again using the heat treat, and then I will measure the static spine. Is the first indication, along with measuring the weight of the shaft, that allows me just to separate the shafts out in terms of groups. You know, so I'll measure the static spine using the traditional means of doing it, and using a spine tester. If for some reason that the shafts are still too stiff, which is often the case, I'll have to run through the process one more time of reducing the diameter, the sandpaper or this little guy here, and I'll continue to reduce it to a point where I get to my spine that I'm targeting. And then once that's done, and again, I'll go through one more heat treat then in that case. Then once that's done, then I can categorize the individual shafts by their spine weight. And you see down here on the floor, that's what I've done. I've collected a bunch of shafts, and I put them in tubes by spine weight. The spine weight varies by 5 pounds per, or a range of 5 pounds. So I've got down here like 50 to 55 pounds would be for these shafts here, and there's 40 to 45. So they're all categorized that way before building arrows. And then the next step, you know, these being self arrows, meaning that I don't put on a nock or any other additional things like a foreshaft or anything like that. I start to produce my arrows. So the self arrow means that the nock itself is a self nock, and I will cut the grooves into the nock end, and I do wrap them with sinew. All these arrows are made with natural materials. So this sinew is actually from the leg of a deer harvested in the area. The fletchings are actually from turkeys harvested in this area as well. So I end up with a final product, and you can see there is this natural taper I mentioned earlier from the nock end to the front end. And then, depending on what kind of arrowhead I choose to use, this is my version of what I call a trade point, just a stainless steel point. And so I will slot the front end, and then I will attach it with glue that I make from pine pitch and ash and a little animal fat. I actually use bacon fat, believe it or not, to add some lubricity to the glue. So it's initially attached with that glue, and then it's wrapped with sinew again, and then glued around that, and then finished. The whole arrow is finished. Given that fact that the sinew itself can loosen up quickly with hydration, exposure to humidity, I do deviate a bit from the primitive arrow philosophy, and I do put a polyurethane coverage on it. So you see here, I've got these trade points. I have arrows where I have hafted the the flint heads. And there's another example of the pine pitch. And then I have, you know, your traditional, again, more modern point, which is your field point for target shooting or small game hunting. So that basically covers it in a real quick video. And I'm, you know, again, I put this video together based on some comments from at Lattle and Arrow Facebook group site. And so I just responded to requests for putting a YouTube video together, and so that's what you got. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this.